So what I'd like to do is I would like to demonstrate some of the principles of object-oriented programming by showing a very simplistic program or an example of sort of working with objects. In this case, we'll be working with a particular object, and this will be a small banking application where we will have an account object, and the account object will be capable of executing certain functionalities. Now, this may be confusing if you haven't yet been exposed to object-oriented programming, but an object is nothing but an instantiation of a class. That is to say, an object cannot, in and of itself, exist alone independently. It is not, in that sense, standalone. It has to be derived from a class from which it will draw functions and certain properties, characteristics, or attributes which will make that object capable of executing certain things, and it will give it the ability to have certain characteristics. So if we could draw a parallel here, we could think of a car object, or rather a car class, and then an object could be, let's say, a Ford car, which could have properties such as colors, and it could have let's see, functionality such as accelerating or deaccelerating. All of this would be encapsulated within the class. In this case, we have an account object. So we initialize the account object by saying, so this is how we initialize the account object. Now I am getting an error here because my account, the name of my initialization should actually have the same name as the class from which it is derived. And so you can notice I have an S here, but not an S there, which is why it was giving me an error. So now that we have a class and we have an object, what we'd like to do, hopefully, is to give the account a name, and we would like to give it an ID. So this is giving me an error because this is not yet feasible. But what we can actually do is we can go back into the class and make it such that this error won't show up because this functionality would be available to us by utilizing the constructor. So at this point, what we can do is we can sort of make the instance variables. Now, by instance variables, I could also say characteristics or properties, just like I said for the car, or I could say, let's say, I could make a name for the account, and I could make an integer for the ID. Now, I do recall that I wanted to check my balance, so that would also be a good variable to have. And I also remember I wanted to check my previous transaction. So in order to do that, I could also check my previous transaction. So I would store that into a variable. So now that I have sort of these instance variables, in order to make this possible, I'm going to utilize the constructor in order to make it so. So I have the accounts constructor here, and the constructor should actually be the same as the class name. So the class is accounts, the constructor should also be accounts. And so here we're actually utilizing the default constructor. And if I print something out, such as hi, then the default constructor will actually utilize this in the method. So here I'm actually using a parameterized constructor, but if it were default, then it should actually reference the constructor that I have in the class and just print out hi, and that's exactly what it does. So I actually want to pass in a name within the account constructor. I want to reference the account constructor, and I want to say, look, I want to have a name and I want to have an ID, because that is exactly what we had in our class, or rather in our desired scenario. So this now doesn't give me an error because I actually have mentioned this in the accounts constructor, which is no longer default, it is now parameterized. Now, you may be confused to say that, well, we have two names and now we have two IDs, but we want to sort of take care of that confusion by saying that the name that we've referred to in the constructor is in fact the same name that we've referred to on the class level. And this ID that we're referring to in the parameter is the same ID that we are in fact referring to on the class level. And so this essentially takes care of that confusion. And now we can actually work with the object's name. Any object that we make and we give it a name or an ID, we can actually work with those variables now. So the instance variables are there just sitting as a placeholder, and the constructor can actually take those instance variables and can initialize them. And actually we can do I could say hi, and I could actually put this dot name down, or I could put name it. I don't think it really matters, but here, if we run the program, we say hi, Jerry. And so now we have an account class with an account ID and name. And so that's how we do that. But we don't actually want this. What we do want is we want to be able to call on an account, and we want to be able to show a menu. So the menu would sort of be a function which would call on other functions, right? Which would be able to deposit or withdraw or show the previous transaction or balance. So here, let's go ahead and create a function to withdraw. So I'm creating a function to withdraw, which is void, because recall, we're not returning anything. Public and static are not mentioned here because public is the access modifier. Here we are encapsulating our function within the class, and so making it public goes against our particular scenario. And we are also not making it static because static implies that it is not attached to a particular object. In this case, it will be attached to a particular object. So we have void withdraw, and we specify an amount that we want to withdraw. Now, if we think about it, when we withdraw from our account, we're actually not withdrawing from our account. We're withdrawing from the balance within our account. And so if we were to withdraw a certain amount, our balance, this would be our balance. The amount that we've specified within the parameters would be sort of extracted from our balance, and that would be our new balance. And so our balance would actually our balance would update to whatever it was before, to actually being balance minus the amount. And it would actually be the same for if we were referring to a deposit, in that we are going to pass in another amount, which is sort of unique to depositing. And that deposit would essentially would influence our balance. And instead of being balance minus amount, where we were talking about withdrawing, we are instead now talking about we're talking about adding to our balance. And so that essentially would be our two main functions here of withdrawing and depositing. So now that we have this in place, we also wanted a function which could show us our previous transaction. Now, our previous transaction would essentially, we're not going to pass an amount here, although you're probably confused as to why we have two amounts. And that's probably a good question. We could have named them something else to sort of dispel that confusion, but this is actually a good opportunity to introduce the idea of scope. Now, scope essentially says that a variable only exists within the closest brackets within which it is confined. And so amount, we notice, is not an instance variable. And so anything on the class level, and this is really the class level, is accessible to each and every method, whether that be the withdraw or deposit method. Amount is not on the class level. So amount is, again, confined to what is its closest set of brackets. And so here it's really exclusive to depositing. And so amount here is really exclusive to withdrawing. So now that we've taken care of that confusion, when we think about the previous transaction, we actually want the previous transaction to be what occurred. If it were a withdraw, right? If it were a withdraw, we would want to sort of print out that a withdraw occurred of a particular amount. And that essentially would be the same else if, right? Which is if this happened, then do this. Otherwise, if this happened, then do this. So this would essentially be a deposit. So if a deposit occurred, then we would just say a deposit occurred of that particular amount. So the question is, how do we sort of symbolize the fact that we've had a withdraw or deposit? We have to have some Boolean condition and some variable which would be exclusive to depositing and exclusive to withdrawing. And so the way we would do this is we would think, well, if I were to withdraw something from an amount, or rather from a balance, then my previous transaction would just be equal to that amount, right? And the same thing here. If I were to deposit something, then and I wanted to tell someone, well, you deposited such and such, that such and such would just be that amount. So previous deposit, or rather previous transaction, excuse me, is actually just equal to that amount. Okay, and so we could actually just take previous transaction and put previous transaction here and here. Okay, and the way that works is, well, exactly the way I've described. But the main problem now is, how do we symbolize that a withdrawal occurred or a deposit occurred? We recognize that we can't, this will only choose one particular scenario. Either it will choose a withdrawal or a deposit. How do we choose whether a deposit or withdrawal occurred? Well, if it's a withdrawal, then we notice that we're subtracting off the balance, so we could just make the amount negative. And if it's a deposit, then we're actually adding on to the balance, so we could just make the amount positive. And so the amount is in fact by default positive here. So we could say, well, if a withdrawal occurred, then that would make the previous transaction negative, which is expressed mathematically as less than 0. And if a deposit occurred, then previous transaction would actually be greater than 0. And that sort of summarizes it. And if neither of those conditions exist, then we can just say no transactions occurred. Now we could go back and say, well, if I'm not taking out 0, I could say, well, if the amount that I want to take out is not equal to 0, then and only then will I, sort of do this particular function. But I don't think that's necessary. I'm trying to keep it very simplistic here so that we understand. We could, of course, go back and make all these revisions, but just to keep it simplistic, we're going to go with the surface layout. So here we have our previous transaction method, which I think works pretty, we've summarized everything that we wanted to, and now we have these functions. So the last thing, recall that what we wanted to do was we wanted to show our menu. Now the menu would sort of comprise of all the functions that we've made. We've made these instance variables so that we can use them later. We've made an account so that we can use the names within the parameters later. We've made these methods so that we can actually use these methods. We've made the withdraw, the deposit, and the previous transaction methods such that we may use those methods somewhere else to make this, to sort of impose this onto our account. So we could make a, let's see, a show menu method. And we're not going to pass anything into the show menu method. The show menu method will just be showing the menu. And within the menu, we want to give some options, right? We want to give the option of, suppose, let's see. So if they deposit, we can say D for deposit, right? Okay. And if they, let's see here, if they do, we'll get a little more of these lines here. If they do deposit, it's D. If they do W, then we could just say that it is a withdraw. And if they do P, then it shows their previous balance. Okay. And if it does D, then we could say, well, if they do B, then we could say current balance. It's actually not going to be previous balance, it's going to be previous transaction. So, and D for deposit. So maybe we don't need this one down here. Well, maybe we do. Let's we want to give an option for, let's see, exiting the menu. E for exiting menu. I think that works. So now we have these options here, but of course we have to give the ability to actually choose one of these options, right? So what I'm thinking is, first let me sort of bring in a scanner inside this method here. I'm going to call it data. You can call it whatever you'd like. New scanner. And we're going to get our output from the system console, system.in. And so you notice by now that scanner is actually not initialized to anything, or it's giving me an error, sorry. And in order to solve that problem, we could just hover over the error and it would import the scanner. So we've given all these options and we want to essentially give, we could say enter an option, right? And by now they could actually enter an option. And that would be, of course, a character. So we could initialize a character next character. So this is usually the way you would do it if it were an integer. Oops, what am I doing? Let's see. Okay, so I have character here and I have option. Okay, so this would be the way you would do it if it were an integer. But we are actually using a character to express what they will choose. And with a character, this particular syntax is not sort of valid. We would actually have to do something like this, where so we actually have to sort of symbolize. Let's see here. So essentially here, I think that to option equals so this may be actually wrong syntax. Okay, I guess it's right. So we're actually taking the char at subroutine to sort of grab the first character of whatever option we insert. And so it is a little different. It is a little tricky. You just want to keep that in mind. But that is essentially what how we would symbolize that here, to give the user the ability to sort of enter a character. It's a little different than what you'd expect, but. And then we have switch statements. We're going to do a switch statement on the character, and we're going to have cases. So if it were case D, then I would know that they're in fact choosing for a deposit. And if it were case D, then I would say, okay, well, how much do you want to deposit, right? How much do you want to deposit? And they would, of course, enter in a particular amount that they want to deposit. And them entering in would mean I'm, again, using the scanner function. And after they enter an amount, I'm going to call on the deposit function, and I will essentially at this point be entering whatever amount they put in into the amount for the function here. And so I'm essentially going to just say deposit whatever amount that they put. And I could give this another name. I could say in amount D for deposit, right? I guess that could be because we've already used amount several times. That's not problematic in a compiler sense, but it is problematic in terms of how we want to see things and differentiate between variables that we have. And so here they say, how much do you want to deposit? And I deposit a particular amount and it breaks. And so essentially I sort of repeat the same thing a couple times for other cases, like if I were to, if I wanted to withdraw, I could ask, how much do you want to withdraw? And I could say my amount is W instead of D, and I could do the same thing here as well. Now for this one, let's see what other functionalities that we wanted available. Let's see, why isn't this giving me, why is it giving me an error? A duplicate case. Okay, so I can't use D several times, but of course that's just a placeholder, so that error should go away. Now I also wanted to check the current balance. So I could check the current balance like this, and I wouldn't need all this stuff here. I wouldn't need to call on the deposit function. And I could just say, well, your balance is essentially just going to be, your balance is this. It's going to be balance. That's all it is. And now let's see what else I had. I had B for current balance, E for exiting the menu. So I guess case E would be responsible for exiting the menu. Sounds good. And I could break. Okay. So essentially we have an option that we choose, and you can choose the option and it will sort of call upon those functions where necessary. But again, I want to sort of keep asking, right? I don't want to just do this once. This should work once, but I don't want to see it's asking D for deposit and whatnot. I'm actually also noticing there isn't a welcome feature here. So let me actually just and I could say this dot name, or I could just say name. They're equated to the same thing, so I believe it doesn't matter. And just for some aesthetics here, I could just print out another line just so that there is a separation between the welcome and the choosing. So we choose a particular option. I could just say, well, what's my D for deposit? How much do you want to deposit? Well, I want to deposit $500. It doesn't do anything after that. I can't check my balance now because it's not asking me for an option. So I want to sort of go back again and ask for another option until I exit the menu. And so in order to do that, what I would do is I would use a do while loop. So I do everything that I've specified here. Everything that I've specified here, but that would be enclosed within a do while loop. Let's see here. Okay, I don't want to mess this up. So maybe that takes care of it. No. So we don't have any issues right now. And so what we do here is we impose a do while loop, and the do while loop is going to be, well, first let's figure out where the switch statement ends. It ends right here. So that's where the end switch statement. And the sort of the method, the show menu method, ends here. So the do while loop is actually going to be within the method. And so I could say, look, I could say do the switch statement, do, and it's going to do the switch statement again and again while the option does not equal to E. Okay, while the option does not equal to E, and so it's just going to keep doing this and until while the option does not equal to E. But it's not asking me for my option again and again. It's just I want to actually ask for the option here. Enter an option. And the ability to enter is only possible if the scanner function is there. Now, option doesn't exist anymore, so let's just make that char option. I think that works. I think that's fine. And so if I go back again, I can enter an option. Let's see, I could choose to deposit. I could say I have $500, and now I could check my balance. I should have $500 now, and it asked me for an option again. So just to make this a little more clear here, let me just sort of do that. And if I were to click E, well, let's see what happens if I click E. So it does exit the menu. So when it does exit the menu, what I want to do is I want to change it around a bit because I'm noticing that I don't have a default case in the event that they enter something else besides any of these options. So if I say default, I could say default, and I could say, well, if they do something that's outside the bounds of the options that they're given, then I could print a line and I could say, well, your option must be, D, W, P, or let's see, E, right? D, W, P, E, and I also had B. think that works. Just speeding through it here, otherwise I would have made this a little more aesthetically pleasing. But if I tried to deposit money, I could deposit $500. I could subtract off, I could withdraw, let's say $200, and then I should be left with $300 if I check my balance. Okay, so this is probably not working. So it's asking me how much I want to deposit. I say 500, and then I say, how much do you want to withdraw? 200. I should be left with 700. I should be left with 300. So something in my method, and this is actually one of the pros of actually having a object-oriented program here is we can actually go back into the method where it seems to be making a mistake. So my withdraw function is taking the balance and it's subtracting. And my deposit function is taking the balance and it's adding. So it's balance plus the amount. So it should work here. I'm saying, well, if it's less than 0, if it's greater than 0, the deposit occurred. So this seems pretty spot on here. Enter an option. Let's see, deposit. Let's see, 500. And then I enter an option to withdraw. Well, let me check my balance. I have 500, so I know that. And when I deposit, or rather when I withdraw, I want to withdraw 200. And now I check my balance, it should be 300, but it's actually adding. So when I want to withdraw, it's actually adding that amount onto my balance. So let's see here. When I want to withdraw, it is actually adding on to the, so I bet it's balance minus the amount. See here, if I specify my balance to be 500 and I check my balance, so my balance is 500, but then I choose to withdraw. So I call on W. So it must be something in the switch statement, right? So I call on W here, and then it takes an amount. So so that's what's happening. So it's calling on the withdraw function, believe it or not. It's calling on the same function. So I have to actually specify withdraw because I did copy paste these down. But so you can see, I mean, some of the merits of having this sort of sectioned out in terms of objects. But so now that we have this all done here, enter an option, we could say, well, I want to let me deposit 5,000. Let me withdraw 2,000. I should be left with 3,000 if I check my balance. And if I enter an option again, let's see. Let me check my previous transaction. So I know my previous transaction was a withdrawal of 2,000. And so if I do, okay, so I do P and it doesn't let me, I haven't actually specified P. I haven't specified the previous transaction functionality at all, in fact. So let me just do P here and call on the previous transaction function. And then it should be good to go. Let me withdraw, and then let me withdraw 2,000, and let me check a withdrawal of 2,000. Let's see. Okay, a withdrawal occurred of 2,000, but it's also asking me for my option must be DWP2. So I probably didn't put a break here, which is probably right. So just adding those breaks are pretty necessary following the syntax. But this is essentially the program here in a very simplistic view. But and so that is how we sort of converse with objects, if you will. And play around with them. Now, of course, there's a wider domain of skill which goes into actually working with objects, but this is sort of a very simplistic approach. So thank you for joining me today.